Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. Today we are taking your questions on the maximal data case for the resurrection. This is sort of a part two. Well, my internet cut out in the first interview that we were doing, where we were looking at. I invited Dr. Lydia McGrew on to sort of compare and contrast the minimal facts case for the resurrection with the maximal data case for the resurrection. Why don't we start? Why don't we start by giving a rough overview for people who are just coming to this conversation new? Why don't we give a quick overview of what these two different cases are, some of the things that we talked about in the previous, just like a quick summary, and then we'll get into some questions. But the main point of this is that we actually opened up questions in the previous stream, but my internet cut out. So we were like, well, what can we do? Let's just schedule a new stream where we just do pure Q&A on this topic, because we were just talking about this before we went live. Dr. McGrew, she may have convinced me that the maximal data case is like the better, the stronger case. So, and I may be a proponent of that at this time. So, give us a quick overview of the differences between the minimal facts case championed by guys like Dr. Craig, Dr. Mike Licona, Gary Habermas, and then your preferred case, which is the maximal data case. What are some of the differences?
Okay, so first of all, interests of absolute accuracy, Dr. William Lane Craig doesn't like to call his minimal facts. He calls it core facts, and it's a little different because he also includes the empty tomb as one of his facts, and there are some other differences. So I just want to throw that in there. But in general, as I said the other time, and please watch that for more detail, the minimalist type, which I would include all of those under that umbrella, it does rely more upon scholarly consensus and tries to find facts that have at least a certain level of scholarly consensus. That includes unbelieving scholars, skeptical scholars, as well as Christians. And it does not rely on the proposition that the gospel accounts of the resurrection are even what the original witnesses claimed. That is to say, not that they're necessarily true, but it doesn't even rely on the proposition that this is not embellished or something like that. It just kind of leaves that out. That's not one of its crucial premises. On the other side, the maximal data case does rely on, while being willing to defend, the premise that the gospel accounts represent at least what the original witnesses claimed without embellishment. It's not a presuppositional approach because we're prepared to defend that, but that's an important premise. And it does not rely on scholarly consensus. So each has a thing that the other relies on, that approach does not rely on, and vice versa.
Okay, why don't we start by, okay, so one thing that we wanted to do at the very beginning of this stream was cover some of the questions that were sent in. We had two super chats that were sent into the other stream that we weren't able to get to because, again, the internet cut out. But we have one from Caleb Jackson and then one from Enrique Colon. So let's start with Caleb's. He says, does the fact that the risen Jesus is seen differently in the Gospels, he is unrecognized by some and others are said to doubt, imply that these may have been subjective experiences? What is your answer to that?
Yeah, so absolutely not. It doesn't imply that at all. It is important to realize that the fact that some people don't recognize him is not the same thing as some people not being able to see or encounter or interact with him at all. So this is not as though one person is saying, hey, look, that's Jesus, and I'm having a conversation with Jesus, and the second guy is saying, dude, I can't see anything. There's nobody there. What's the matter with you? That would be evidence of a subjective experience, but that's not what we find at all. Another point is that to pick out the difficulties that they sometimes have in recognizing him, and that's only in some of the stories, and then leave out the rest, is cherry picking data. So let's suppose that they didn't recognize him because he was glowing brightly and it was like he had no face. Okay, that would be evidence of something weird going on that was maybe not a physical resurrection, maybe an appearance from heaven or a vision or something. But that's not given as a reason at all. Or it doesn't say they couldn't recognize him because he looked sort of foggy and fuzzy like a ghost. That that's not the reason. In fact, in two at least of the three, there are pretty obvious potential ordinary reasons. Like he's on the shore and it's dawn, and they're out in the boat, so there's a distance and the light is not good and that kind of thing. Or Mary Magdalene, she's crying. She actually is probably turns right away from him the minute he speaks to her. She's like, no, uh, you know, she turns away from him, thinking he's the gardener, doesn't even look at him. Then she hears his voice and she recognizes him. And they do eventually recognize him. Now, we've all had this happen. I've run into people in the store that I don't recognize at first, and then I do eventually. So it looks like a mundane experience where if you take the whole story, they're interacting with him intersubjectively, they're in these cases able to eat with him or to touch him, or maybe they at first think he's a ghost, but then he says, no, see, I'm not a ghost. I can eat. You can touch me. So we shouldn't just cherry pick out um, an immediate doubt or an initial inability to recognize and then act like we're going to construct some completely different type of appearance experience and say, oh, that maybe indicates it was a subjective experience. If we're going to use the fact that it mentions they couldn't recognize him, then we should use the other aspects of the experience that indicate that he was very much intersubjectively verifiable, very much physically present. And so I don't think that indicates that at all.
Okay, so let's now turn to the question from Enrique, and he says, great conversation. As a novice apologetic student, can you share a good source for evidence for the Bible? I think to prove the source, we can better prove the resurrection.
There are so many. I can't just pick one. So the first thing I'm going to do is slightly promote myself a little bit. I have 3 books out there, Hidden in Plain View, The Mirror or the Mask, and The Eye of the Beholder. The third one is about the Gospel of John specifically. Those were all written with these controversies in mind. So they're very much contemporary and addressed to these kinds of controversies. They're all on Kindle. So, like, if you have Kindle Unlimited, then they would be free. But if you don't, they're only like $10 on Kindle. So there are those. But then there are so many other great books. There's a little book called Can We Trust the Gospels by he's a great scholar, Peter J. Williams. There's a book called Easter Enigma by the late John Wenham, but I mean, he's like a 20th century scholar. It's not like from long ago, where he harmonizes the resurrection accounts. I agree with almost all of his harmonizations. And then if you go back to the old guys, like from the 19th century, William Paley, Evidences of Christianity, a view of the evidence of Christianity, or the Horai Paulini, which is about the Pauline epistles and Acts. Those are all free because they're not in copyright anymore. There are so many. Oh, and another book that I think is in print right now by Colin Hemer called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History on the Reliability of Acts. That's just excellent. So I know you only ask for one source, but that gives more, and there's more still, but I'll leave it there. Please start digging in. Just grab some of those and dig in.
I have a question. When you're presenting your maximal data case, do you get into textual criticism at all?
I don't usually. You mean like, so specifically are our texts reliable? I mean, yes, they are. And it's one of those things where if someone is questioning that, then you're going to want to be ready to go down that trail. But I usually find that the reliability of the Gospels is being questioned at a way that's sort of downstream from that, where it's like, yeah, fine, even granting that we have the text, they made stuff up, so, and so I try to distinguish reliability in those two senses. It could certainly be part of a maximal data case, but it would depend on what the particular person or people you were talking with were doubting or asking about.
Okay, so let's get into some questions that are coming in today. So here's one from, looks like Ken Hilker. Ken Hilker. What is the epistemology used to accept the gospel narratives if not relying on scholarly consensus?
Well, it's relying on evidence. So let me put it to you this way. The people who say that they're relying on scholarly consensus also claim that there's good evidence. In other words, let's say they're relying on scholarly consensus for the empty tomb, for example. Um, the claim is that there's a good argument and that the argument is just so great that that's why we have this scholarly consensus. And the same for any of them. In fact, they'll get indignant if you tell them they're just blindly relying on scholarly consensus. They'll say, "You're misrepresenting us. That's not what we're doing." So they don't want you to. They don't want to say, just shut up and accept scholarly consensus. In my opinion, sometimes they do end up saying shut up and accept scholarly consensus, but that's not how they're presenting it. So okay, allegedly the case is so good, and that's why we have that scholarly consensus. Now what I'm doing is I'm saying, fine, then let's look at the case instead of just looking at the scholarly consensus and treating it as a black box where we don't know what's inside it. It could be, you know, we're just supposed to take it for granted that we wouldn't have the scholarly consensus. Let's try to access the case that's actually behind this. And when you try to access the case, then you get that independence of mind and you recognize that there's a case for something much more than the extremely watered down appearance claim that is the only way you can get this 90+% scholarly consensus. So what we're trying to do is we're thinking for ourselves, we're looking at the evidence, and we're willing to stand up and defend that thing for ourselves. And that's a lot better because I'll tell you, if you get into a debate, so for example, suppose you get into a debate with Bart Ehrman and he says, "Well, I don't admit group appearances. I don't admit the empty tomb." You're going to look pretty silly if you stand there and go, "But Bart, 70%, 75% of scholars, admit the empty tomb." He's going to go, "So what?" So you're going to need to be prepared to do better than that anyway. And therefore, I think once we're prepared to do that, we can do so much more.
All right, from Callum S. And he sent in a couple questions, so we'll get to both of his. He says, Lydia mentioned on Facebook that the minimal facts approach may have teeth against natural theories. Would she say you need a maximal approach to rule out paranormal theories?
Right, so that's a really important distinction. And it was something I got into just a little bit briefly in our earlier presentation. Um, yes, I think that maximal data is really important in answering paranormal, like a ghost or something. And what I think a lot of people don't realize is that you could have even group appearances that would be evidence for something other than that would be better explained by something that is non-resurrection. So let me just make up something. Suppose that a group of people said that they saw somebody after he died and they even heard him say a few words and they went to try to touch him. Each one of them went to try to touch him and their hand went right through. Okay, like he was not tangible. You could reach your hand right through him. And he looked see-through. Well, now, is that evidence of a resurrection? Answer, no. I mean, in a sense, what's the best explanation of that? Oh my gosh, there are ghosts after all. Or, maybe if you're doing the Doctor Who thing, maybe it's alien technology or a time traveler or something. I watched a Doctor Who episode recently where it was a ghost, but it was really a time traveler trying to come into our time or something. But the point is, if it was really definitely intangible and yet seemed to be talking to you, that could be evidence that Humean naturalism is false, but also evidence against the claim that person was physically resurrected. It would be evidence that that person is speaking to you from beyond the grave as a ghost. So I think people don't understand that something can be evidence against naturalism and simultaneously evidence against a physical resurrection. That just astonishes people. They think in terms of simple dichotomies, but to really partition up the possibilities, there are more possibilities than just naturalism and Christianity, and that's important to bear in mind.
All right, so Callum, he's got another question. He says, Baker Heitch has said a minimal facts approach wouldn't clinch it by itself, but with a decent prior, he finds it sufficient. Does Lydia think a reasonable argument can be made for a decent prior?
I think a reasonable argument can be made for a decent prior, but I think Max is wrong that then it's enough. Okay, so I mean, it's sort of a yes and no answer. Sure, the liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma of C.S. Lewis is actually relevant to the prior. People don't always think that. The argument from prophecy is relevant to the prior. The argument for any argument for Judaism is relevant to the prior. If it accesses information, before the resurrection, from before the resurrection of Jesus. So, yeah, in a sense, I think we can get a decent prior. But at that point, there's still the question, what did they experience? And let me make another point here. If you're going into the minimal facts case because you're explicitly not arguing that the accounts are unembellished, then suppose you have someone who's part of that consensus who definitely thinks the accounts were embellished, that they added those physical details. I mean, that's what Dale Allison thinks. That's certainly what Bart Ehrman thinks. That's what a ton of, I would say probably the majority of skeptical scholars think those physical details were added. Isn't that kind of suspicious in itself? If we're going to access what scholars think, and scholars think that the physical details were added, shouldn't that make us wonder? Well, okay, if they felt like they had to add physical details, maybe they had no true physical details to talk about. So there's this really odd reticence in the minimal facts thing. As I mentioned before, Dr. Bill Craig calls the Palean approach, which is essentially the maximal data approach, forever obsolete. In Reasonable Faith, he calls it that. And he says this is because of higher criticism, which came in the 19th century after Paley. If you're going to do that and then say we've got to just mine these facts out without doing a full-on attack on higher criticism and on those, stripping away the supposed embellishments of the accounts, then you're leaving yourself very vulnerable to someone saying, yeah, those things were added. And what are you going to say then? Oh, well, maybe even if they were added, maybe Jesus really was risen from the dead physically. Well, if they were added, isn't that reason to think he wasn't really physically risen from the dead? Because if he was really physically risen from the dead and appeared to his disciples, we would have true things that they could say so that nobody needed to make up and nobody needed to embellish. That's a point that I think is not often enough taken into account. And so the minimal facts case, with its odd sort of dancey approach, or even minimalist case, even core facts approach, and its oddly dancing approach to the question of gospel embellishments is really weak. And that's why it's not going to do it, I believe, even if you have a so-called decent prior. I want to make one more comment here. In a fairly recent YouTube discussion with Pelagia, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Pelagia asked Dr. Michael Licona if it was possible that the resurrection accounts were embellished, and if it was if there was something that should cause us to think that they definitely were not embellished. And Dr. Licona said, well, I think it's impossible to know. He said to Pelagia, I think it's impossible to know because embellishments can arise on a story pretty quickly in the ancient world. And also in his book on why are there differences in the Gospels and debates with Bart Ehrman, he's specified specific places where he thinks that the authors did change the stories, like that Luke moved the appearance from Galilee down to Jerusalem, which is a pretty big change if you think about it. So I think that shows you the kinds of concessions that minimalists can be prepared to make. And at that point, I'm sorry, Max, I like you, but know if you're prepared to make those kinds of concessions, then even a decent prior plus that kind of approach is not going to do it.
All right, we've had a few super chats that were sent in. We'll get to these now. This one from Who Swept My Minds. Glad to see Dr. McGrew on. Her video about the minimal facts argument and epistemic entanglement was really helpful for me in understanding that issue. Not really
Thank
a
you.
question, but just a nice
Hey,
comment.
put the link in. You
Yeah.
can go find it, or I'll go find it. We can put the link in down there. Yeah, epistemic entanglement is an important topic, but I'm just going to leave that to my video because my video covered that, I think, pretty well.
Yeah, and if you send me a link, I'll make sure to put it in the show notes.
For sure, for sure.
All right, from Carmel Crunk. She says, when discussing the historical evidence of the resurrection with a new atheist, what questions would you ask to get them to rethink about their rejection of the resurrection?
That's interesting because the new atheists are usually, hardline Humeans. One might ask them, have you read any responses to Hume from a non-Humean perspective? Or one might ask if they've heard of, there's a book by, and this guy is not a Christian, John Earman, not to be confused with Bart Ehrman. He's written a book called Hume's Abject Failure on the probability theoretic problems with Hume. Another question that one might ask them would be, are you assuming that miracles absolutely cannot happen? And how is that being open to evidence? And, are you willing to be open to evidence to the contrary? So I think those might be some conversation starters. And then after that, you might try to see where the conversation goes and maybe look up some maximal data things or some things about the reliability of the Gospels. I often find that just having one or two arguments in your pocket is a good thing. You don't have to memorize everything. You don't have to have it all at your fingertips. If you just have one or two things to say, that can get conversation started. And as the saying goes, put a stone in their shoe and then hope to carry on further conversations as time goes by.
All right, from Enrique, he sent in another question today. He's watching the stream today. Thanks, Enrique, for another super chat. He says, did Thomas, who had the privilege of putting his hands in the wounds of Jesus, leave any accounts that were found? Or are the accounts what we have in Acts? Thank you.
The accounts are what we have in Acts, and I think those were left by Thomas. So, yeah, yes, and yes. But if you mean accounts aside from that, no, we don't have some separate account like I, Thomas, did this and I, Thomas, did that. But I think that the Gospel of John is defensible. Of course, I have the whole book on the Gospel of John, the Eye of the Beholder. And the argument then is that John is not an author who makes stuff up. And also, I argue for the authorship of the book by a disciple of Jesus. So then he would be in a position to know, even though he was not Thomas, but he would be in a position to have known whether this happened or not, because he would have been right there in those days after Jesus' death. So that trilemma, either he's lying, he's mistaken, or he's telling the truth. Well, if he puts in there these stories about Thomas and he's actually one of Jesus' disciples, there's no way you could be mistaken about whether that whole thing happened, that whole story, or it seemed to happen at least. Maybe you're all having crazy, wild, unprecedented hallucinations or something like that. But that's very improbable. So if John doesn't make things up, then that is an account of the Doubting Thomas episode from a person who's claiming to have actually witnessed it.
Here's a question that's somewhat related from the Reformed Arminian. What would you say is one of the best or most interesting undesigned coincidences that you've come across?
Oh, people ask me this all the time, and they're just all so wonderful. I mean, they do vary. Don't get me wrong. They do vary somewhat in strength, but there are just so many that are so great. I really like the one about Herod's servants. And one of the reasons I like it is because it confirms unique material in Matthew. There aren't a whole lot that confirm unique material in Matthew. Another reason I like it is that it challenges a certain view of Matthew as being so reliant on Mark that anytime there's a story in Matthew and in Mark both, and anything's unique in Matthew, he must be making it up. So I like it for certain reasons. And so the way this one goes is that Matthew's telling the story of the death of John the Baptist, and as a lead-in, he tells about Herod hearing of Jesus and saying, "This must be John the Baptist risen from the dead." And Mark has the same lead-in, some similar wording, so it, you know, Matthew may be partly using Mark as a source, but there's a unique phrase in Matthew that Herod said this to his servants, and that's not in any other gospel. And then you go over to Luke, totally different passage. It's not about Herod or anything. It's about these women who followed Jesus and contributed to his ministry. And it mentions that one of them was Joanna, the wife of Husa, who was Herod's steward or household manager. And so that's fascinating, because what that shows is, we might think that to his servants thing in Matthew is just, he's just trying to make it more vivid. He's just making something up. But now we see that Matthew actually had a contact with the inner circle of Herod's servants, or plausibly he did that. Joanna was someone that Matthew could have actually personally known, who could have told what Herod was saying to his servants, because the household manager would be in close contact with the rest of the servants. So that's just one that I really like. But there are even more, and with Acts, there are some amazing ones, but they take a long time to lay out. So watch my channel and maybe look at the Acts reliability playlist. I've had some one in Acts that I actually took quite a lot of time to lay out with maps and everything, and you might enjoy that one especially.
Okay, we've had a super chat sent in from Mintat1231. He or she says, "What if someone says we need to do the historical reconstruction, sources, literary criticism, etc., before the matter of reliability even comes up?"
I'm not quite sure what's meant by historical reconstruction. Perhaps what is meant is to start by doubting that these texts are really from people who knew, and so forth, and to try to find do literary criticism on them and sort of tear them apart, and strip parts of them off and say, oh, that probably came from some other source that wasn't really what really happened or whatever, and then talk about reliability. And I would certainly say no, that's getting it backwards, because that would be basically assuming that they're not what they present themselves as. So what I suggest instead is that we look at how they present themselves, and then we give that hypothesis a genuine run for its money. In other words, we put that on the table and we say, okay, if they're what they present themselves as, then they're reliable, they're historical, they're from sincere people who were in a position to know, maybe disciples, or maybe one removed from that, like Luke wasn't a disciple of Jesus himself. And let's actually see how that hypothesis fares at explaining the data. And I would argue that it fares extremely well. So I would put that question of reliability front and center rather than doing something else first.
Okay, from Nico R. For my question, what response could we Christians give towards skeptics who respond that we have data bias with regard to the evidences we interpret about the accounts of the resurrection?
People can say that all the time. I mean, it's fairly obvious. We can point to many ways in which skeptics have, data bias. But I think the best way to counter that is just to be prepared to talk about evidence on both sides. So I want to say, please don't feel like you have to do all of this or despair, okay? But gradually read and become able to do more and more of encountering alleged contrary evidence. So, for example, contradictions in the Gospels. One of the approaches you find from minimalists. Now, here I'm going to give almost a verbatim quotation from Dr. William Lane Craig, and this is the sense in which he is a minimalist, even though he doesn't like to have his approach called minimal facts. He says, I will grant, for the sake of the argument, all that the skeptic wants to claim in the way of contradictions in the Gospels, because, and now I'm going off of verbatim, but summarizing it, because he believes that even granting all of that for the sake of the argument, he can support these facts, and then he can build the case from them, even if you grant all of that. Well, my goodness, do you know how many contradictions this guy? That's an awful lot. I mean, maybe he just overstated, but he says, I'll grant for the sake of the argument all the skeptic wants to say about contradictions. That's not just a few things. So what I think instead we need to be ready to do is to sort of man up and say, we're going to talk about contradictions. No, we don't necessarily need to be able to defend inerrancy, but we need to be able to defend robust reliability. And if you grant for the sake of the argument all that the skeptic wants to claim, you're not going to have robust reliability anymore. I would recommend my book, The Mirror or the Mask, in that respect, because I think you can see there is that so far from just kind of going with my own data bias, I'm going right for alleged contradictions, alleged contrary evidence, and I'm trying to answer them. And I do this on my YouTube channel as well. I want to say right here, I'm not an inerrantist. So there are times, and I want to say that they're not major things, but where I would say, yeah, I think that may be a contradiction. Just like you can have between two really, really reliable witnesses, you can have a minor contradiction because somebody remembers wrong. But nonetheless, no, that is not. That's just a silly, manufactured artificial contradiction, and here's why. So that's how we can answer that data bias, is by being prepared to respond to alleged evidence against.
Yeah, and the whole question of bias, like, sorry, I swallowed my water wrong. The whole bias objection I've never found very strong, because everybody deals with bias. Like you said at the very beginning of your answer, it's like skeptics deal with bias too. So you could argue
Well,
that
right.
the Christian is experiencing bias, but you can also argue that the skeptic is experiencing bias. So it's not like it's a double-edged sword. It's not really going to do much for you that it can't do for the other person as well.
Well, and that's where too, if you say, well, what do you think is the biggest, pick three, I don't know, objections to gospel reliability that you think if I weren't experiencing data bias, I would be bowled over by. And, hit me
Yeah.
with your best shot, right? And they do it, and they're awful. Often they're either super, super trivial, like how many angels were there at the tomb, which is like super easily answered, because saying that there was one angel at the tomb is not denying that there were two angels at the tomb, that kind of thing. Or they're just extremely, arguments from silence or something like that. And so once you learn a few basic sort of karate moves to answer those, and you find that they apply over and over and over again, I think you can ask at least a fair-minded audience to judge who is more biased in this argument.
All right, let's move on from Noho Life. He says, minimalists usually focus just on Paul, but as a maximalist, what else is relevant / necessary to study? Fulfilled prophecy, other miracles, character of Jesus, psychology of belief, etc.
Gospel reliability. That's the biggie. You are so right. Minimalists are trying to do it through Paul, do it through Paul, do it through Paul. And I think that's a terrible idea. For one thing, because Paul himself, his only experience of the risen Jesus was after Jesus had ascended into heaven. So I've had people argue like wildcats Jesus was literally floating up over the Damascus Road. If you'd thrown a rock, you would have hit him. Okay, but Paul didn't throw a rock. Okay, Paul didn't eat a meal with Jesus. We know that. Paul didn't, touch Jesus after he was risen from the dead. So, gospel reliability is the biggie. Now, character of Jesus is relevant to gospel reliability. Because of that unity of character, which gets denied. People will say the Jesus of John is different from the Jesus of the synoptics. That's false, and I answer that in The Eye of the Beholder. But what we want to be talking about, you'll see this in my Areopagus presentation. What kind of books are these, and what kind of authors are these? Because when you argue for the character of the authors and the nature of the documents, that they did not make stuff up, and that they're careful and truthful and close to the facts, then you get so much more data as at least what the original witnesses claimed. And that's how you can make a stronger case.
Okay, question from Denian. How does one respond to skeptics who deny the reliability of historical evidence and legitimacy of history itself as a field? And they deny other secular historical figures too, unless there's video.
At that point, there's not much you can do with the person. That's a very unreasonable person. About the only thing that I've tried with those folks is that they'll often say science is fine, but history is not. So, because they'll go with like the repeatability of scientific experiments. Sometimes you'll hear that, and I would at that point out to them that we are always dealing in those cases with history, even though it might be recent history. So you have a paper, let's say, that was just released. Let's say it was just released yesterday. Okay, first of all, you have the fact that the paper was released yesterday. That's already history. Second of all, you have the fact that the authors, the corresponding authors in the paper, are telling you what experiments they carried out. That's their testimony to what they did at some time in the past, maybe a year ago or something. So I think it's important to realize the ubiquity, which means everywhereness, of historical testimony, and the impossibility of carrying out either science or ordinary life. So, for example, if that guy who says that his water heater breaks down, my water heater is just broken down, and he calls a repairman, and the repairman goes downstairs and then comes upstairs and says, well, I did this test and this test. This is what I found that's wrong with your water heater. You're taking his word for something that historically happened. It might have only been 10 minutes ago, but it historically happened, that he did these tests in your water heater. And a million other things. Does this person believe that Joe Biden was elected president? So I would push the person on sort of a reductio of truly trying across the board to deny witness testimony and deny historical evidence.
So Denian rather has sent in another question. It's a little bit off topic, but I'm curious to know if you have any thoughts on it. He says, as an analytic philosopher, what response might Lydia give to skeptics who say that on both a personal and universal level, people didn't choose to be born/created?
No, they didn't. I don't know if this is supposed to be a problem, but maybe this is supposed to be a problem of evil type question. They didn't choose to be born/created, and therefore, if someone's born and he has a miserable life, this is an argument against the existence of God. Maybe that's of a good God or something. Maybe that's where that's sort of going. Problem of evil is very interesting. I do not try to say that there is no problem of evil, but I think it is answerable from Christianity. And so here's maybe a little way to tie it in. I would even go with a more maximal approach to the problem of evil. I would say Christian theism has way more resources to respond to the problem of evil than bare theism. Like there's just some kind of God or something like that. Because Christian theism, for example, says that evil and suffering are used for soul building, that there was a fall of man, and so forth. So I would encourage, in response to any kind of problem of evil, maybe using um, antinatalism, like how terrible that so many people are born to suffer, to be prepared to defend Christianity and then use those rich resources to answer the problem of evil. Let me also add that you see me reclining here. I saw some rather nasty comments from some skeptics about that. About a year and 3 months ago, I developed a very severe chronic pain condition, and I have better days and worse days, but it's not going away. So I've had a few blog posts I've posted that have been more sort of existential, more personal, as I'm personally wrestling with the problem of evil in my own life. And, the great thing that I can say is that I believe Christianity holds up even in that dark valley of personal pain and suffering and evil. So um, God God has given me that and allowed me to keep my faith through all of that. So I'll just throw out that personal note there.
Mm. Yeah, the problem of evil is a very tough subject. It's something that I take very seriously on this channel. So that's part of the reason why I wanted to throw that comment in there. But thanks for your thoughts on that. All right, moving on from, it looks like the name Hahau. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Did we have any evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ apart from the Bible, and how much can we rely on them?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think the difficulty is that um, if something refers to the resurrection and it's outside of the Bible, it's usually not independent. So, for example, the church fathers. Okay, but where do the church fathers get it from? It's not like they are independently attesting that the resurrection happened. They're downstream from the disciples. They're, younger, later, and so forth. This, by the way, is why I am concerned about the book Person of Interest by J. Warner Wallace. I feel that the book has two different statements that are in tension. At one point, it seems to be saying this is just a preparation for the gospel. This is just showing that it's kind of interesting that Jesus has been such an influential person in history. And what can we say about Jesus from non biblical sources shows that it wasn't all made up in, I don't know, 325 at the Council of Nicaea or something. But then at a different point in the book, it says that we can have a strong case that for Jesus' deity entirely without using the New Testament. No, we do not have a strong case for Jesus' deity without using the New Testament. So I believe that uh, Mr. Wallace did not quite hit the bullseye with that book because I think it overpromised at certain points in the book. So I would not encourage using that approach. However, we do have indirect evidence, which isn't what you're thinking of, but I think you should be thinking of it, for the resurrection from non biblical sources in the form of incidental confirmations of the Gospels. So, for example, John says the people at Jesus' crucifixion divided his clothes into four parts. And he doesn't even say that there were four soldiers. But he claims to have been a witness of the crucifixion. Now we go over to non-biblical Roman sources, and we find them saying that a guard is composed of four soldiers. And all that John says is they divided his clothes into four parts. That's confirmation of the resurrection from non biblical sources, indirectly, because it confirms that the gospel authors knew what they were talking about. And there are many of these. I'll be talking about more of those. I do some in my existing books. And when I hope to come out with my next book called Testimonies to the Truth, I have 2 chapters on incidental confirmations of customs and culture and geography and so forth from extra biblical sources.
So it looks like we have one more question. So we'll get to this, and if any others come in while we're answering this one, then so be it. But this is the last one that I've got queued up from the Reformed Arminian. He says, what are your thoughts on Markan or Lucan priority?
I've not looked into Lucan priority, but I would be, from what I've seen, well, I've kind of looked into it. I would be somewhat inclined against it. Um, I'm not opposed to Markan priority. I have a video on this. Please look at my YouTube channel, what I think of the synoptic problem. I tried to put an unmistakable title there because there have been some people who've wrongly stated what I think of the synoptic problem. I lean somewhat toward a kind of Markan priority, but perhaps preceded by a Hebrew Matthew. So it's kind of a combination of Matthew and Markan priority. But I think our Matthew, Greek Matthew, was a second version written by Matthew, but later. So kind of Hebrew Matthew, then Mark, then Greek Matthew, and probably after that, or approximately at the same time as Greek Matthew, Luke. I don't think Luke had access to Greek Matthew. That I think is clear. He may have had access to Hebrew Matthew, if there was a Hebrew Matthew. But I want to exercise a word of caution here, and you'll find this in that video, what I think of the synoptic problem. Do not let people stuff the phrase Markan priority with stuff that it doesn't contain, or the phrase the two-source hypothesis. You will get bullied where people will go, well, most scholars grant Markan priority in the two-source hypothesis. So therefore, if we find something in Matthew that's also in Mark, or in Luke that's also in Mark, that means they got it from Mark. Like they only got it from Mark. Okay, like they had no other source of information about that. And what they're doing, I call this the erasure of Matthew and Luke. It's the erasure of Matthew and Luke as historical sources in their own right if a story is also found in Mark. Go back in this stream to where I talked about that to his servants, undesigned coincidence. Remember that I emphasized that story, and even some similar wording is also found in Mark about Herod, and this is John the Baptist risen from the dead, but not the phrase to his servants. If Matthew or Luke has additional material not found in Mark concerning a story that is found in Mark, the prima facie case is that they had an additional source of information, and we need to take that seriously. So don't let anybody tell you that Markan priority means anything extra is a made-up embellishment. I want to put that warning out there. So that's very brief my opinion about Markan priority.
So I've got one last question, just as I'm thinking through this maximal data case. So suppose that a skeptic wanted to like grant that the Gospels are reliable. What alternative would they have at that point? Would they? Do you think that there would do what?
If they wouldn't grant it, you said?
No, if they do grant gospel reliability,
oh, okay.
Right? Would there be any recourse at that point, or would they have to accept the resurrection?
Well, it would certainly make it a lot easier, but it's not by any means a deductive case. And this is where I last time said, you're not question begging. You're not like just building the conclusion into the premises. But at that point, I would take them straight to that trilemma. If anything, I present that trilemma up front, right? Deceivers, mistaken, or telling the truth. I always present that up front. And if they're granting reliability and that the gospel accounts of the resurrection at least give us what the witnesses claimed, then I would expect that the argument would go to their attempting to hang on to, one of those other options. And I think they're going to have a hard time of it. They may think they can. I've had people press the deceiver option quite a bit. I think they just made it up, or something very careless, like, Jim Jones, all those people, they died for something that was a lot of nonsense. You've heard these things, right? Muslim suicide bombers, or whatever, Japanese suicide bombers, or whatever. So they may try some kind of flippant version of the deceived or deceiver thing. And at that point, you have to bring them back to the the differences and the ways that those are not comparable. This was something that was open to the senses. This was an empirical statement. This was not an ideology. This isn't dying for a political cause or something like that. This wasn't them just taking, somebody else's word for it. There were these multiple different people who were actually, again, if you grant gospel reliability, are actually claiming this. You've got the women claiming this. You've got the disciples claiming this. You got the disciples on the road to Emmaus claiming these things. So there's a measure of independence there. So that's not at all like suicide bombers. That's not at all like, Jim Jones telling people to drink the Kool-Aid or whatever. So at that point, that's where I think the argument would be to bad analogies, to try to push one of the other options, the deceived or deceiver options. That's what I would expect.
All right, I think that's going to do it for us today. This was it was great. I'm glad actually that we were able to schedule this. I apologize again for the internet going out beyond my control. But is there anything that you would like to leave with the audience before we close it out?
I'm just going to ask him to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And I also have, this is starting to be pushed out, my old content to Anchor and Spotify and stuff as audio starting back in 2020. So it's all old content so far, but we're hoping to catch up immediately. So if you like it that way, do it that way. And I think what I would ask is just if you've been inclined to the minimal facts case, or you've been inclined to think that, I'm just getting hot up about nothing, delve in a little more, like what we've done here. Like if you didn't watch the other video, go watch the other video. Or if you want something to read, you can read some blog posts that I've written about this or whatever. But delve into it first rather than assuming it's much ado about nothing. So that I think that's fair to request.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, like you may have convinced me that the maximal data approach is the one to take, because I think I mentioned this before the stream that I've already had my doubts about the minimal facts argument being strong enough, and so adding like biblical reliability, it seems like that might actually be a necessary component for a strong argument for the resurrection. So you may have made a convert out of me as a result of these couple streams.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, no problem. All right, well, we'll see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family.